Mike Trout is one of the greatest baseball players of all time. He's a 3-time MVP, 11-time All-Star, and he currently has the largest contract in baseball history. But yet, 21 teams passed on selecting Trout in the 2009 MLB draft. So what happened, and why was Mike Trout almost completely overlooked? In hindsight, it doesn't make much sense, but there were many reasons for why this happened, and the first started long before Mike Trout even touched a baseball. The year is 1991 in Millville, New Jersey, and despite the fact that Mike Trout has just been born, there's already a major obstacle in the way of his future baseball career. You see, in baseball scouting, there's something called the Northeast stigma. Whether it be from the harsh winters or just bad competition, players from the Northeast have had a history of struggling after reaching the majors, and as a result, most teams pay a lot less attention to players in that region. So just like that, Trout's odds were already against him, but luckily, he had some help too. His father was a former second baseman who had a brief career in the minor leagues, and naturally, that talent rubbed off on Mike. In 2005, he began his high school career, playing several sports but excelling in baseball and basketball. During his senior year in 2009, Trout had a .531 batting average with 18 home runs, setting a new high school record for the entire state of New Jersey. Now, with these numbers, scouts would normally be popping up everywhere, but for Trout, there was really only one. Greg Morehart was a scout in the Northeast for the Angels, and after seeing Trout play for the first time, he was blown away, saying that he's the strongest and fastest 17-year-old I've ever seen. And when he would take batting practice, Morehart said that it was like a gunshot. Now, during that time, scouts would grade players based on a 20 to 80 scale called overall future potential. Pretty much anything over 60 is elite, and Morehart initially gave Trout a grade of 75. This rating meant that he saw Trout as a future Hall of Fame level player while he was still in high school, but other teams didn't exactly feel the same way. Baseball America's first scouting report on Trout stated that his bat is not a sure thing, but he has a chance to be a solid to average hitter with average or better power. It went on to say that he was strong, but nobody would describe him as fluid. So how is it possible for the Angels to have seen something in Trout when no one else did? In hindsight, it seems like every other team just had bad scouts, but there's many other reasons that could explain why this happened. The first was Trout's lack of exposure, and being in New Jersey definitely didn't help. You see, scouts operate based on patterns, and New Jersey had a pattern of failure. In 2006, the 9th pick of the draft was a player named Billy Rowell, who also grew up in New Jersey and turned out to be a massive disappointment. He was drafted in front of 2-time Cy Young winner Tim Lincecum, but yet never even made it to the majors. And as a result, scouts were led to believe that they overestimated his talent because they only saw him play against bad competition. Not to mention, scouting players in the Northeast is just difficult because of the harsh winters. Several teams later admitted that they could have gone to see Trout play, but they didn't for those exact reasons. Now, the second biggest obstacle for Trout was that he was still in high school. Because of how young they are, high school players are inherently seen as more risky than college players. The MLB draft is much different from pretty much every other sport in that it usually takes many years for the players to actually contribute, and as a result, it's almost impossible to know how they're going to turn out. But for other teams, this didn't matter as much, and they simply didn't need another center fielder. A lot of teams make their picks based on their needs, instead of drafting based on talent. So even if they thought Trout was the better player, they would still pick someone else if they already felt like they had enough center fielders. However, your place in the draft is not only based on things like talent and location, but also by the level of competition. And the 2009 draft class had some of the best competition in recent years, or at least that's what everybody thought. Overall, 24 players were selected before Trout, and despite the fact that 6 of these players never even made it to the majors, there were a few that showed much more promise than Trout did, at least at the time. The first overall pick went to Steven Strasburg, a pitcher out of San Diego State who was known as the best pitching prospect in years. Despite only being 20 years old, he was already touching 100 miles an hour on the mound, and unlike Trout, the Nationals were expecting Strasburg to almost immediately contribute after being drafted. drafted. And while this did end up being true, he would only make it through a few months of his first season before needing Tommy John surgery. Looking back, Strasburg was still a good pick, but injuries have held him back, and he's definitely no Mike Trout. The next best choice that was picked above Trout turned out to be another pitcher, Zach Wheeler. Now, despite the fact that Wheeler was also in high school, he was already throwing mid-90s on the mound. And for the Giants, who had a history of developing young pitchers, he seemed like the perfect fit. However, they ended up trading him to the Mets before he even made it to the majors. Throughout his career with the Mets and the Phillies, Wheeler has been pretty good, but once again, he's no Mike Trout. The third best pick was AJ Pollock, drafted 17th by the Diamondbacks. Pollock was in college at Notre Dame, and he was seen as a safe bet with high potential. And just like Trout, Pollock was a solid center fielder with hitting, speed, and defense. Now, for the most part, Pollock turned out to be exactly what the Diamondbacks wanted, but looking back, that's not who they wish they had. Now, before we get to the Angels, there is one other team who considered taking Trout. The A's had the 13th pick in the draft, and unlike most teams, their president Billy Beane once made the trip to see him play. However, he picked the wrong game to go because Trout went 0 for 5 and Beane said that we didn't even get to see him run. So instead of Trout, they went with Grant Green, a shortstop out of California who ended up with a negative 1.7 WAR over 5 seasons. With the 25th pick, the Angels finally selected Mike Trout, the only high school player who showed up at the draft. The other teams hadn't realized their mistake quite yet, but they would very soon. His first few seasons were spent in the minors, but it didn't take long before he was called up in 2011, and at first, he struggled. Not long after, he was sent back down, but in 2012, Trout completed his first full season in the majors, and it proved everyone wrong. That year, Trout hit .326 with 30 home runs, 83 RBIs, and an incredible 49 stolen bases. He won Rookie of the Year and almost won MVP, but somehow that was only a taste of what was to come. Over the course of his career, Trout has shown that he's one of the best players in baseball history. He's won MVP 3 times and has been second in voting 4 times. He's also the active leader in WAR with 85.3, which is more than all 3 of the best players drafted ahead of him combined. And during his 3rd MVP season in 2019, the Angels signed Trout to a 12-year, $426 million contract, the largest deal in sports history at the time. Looking back, the only unfortunate thing in his career is the fact that he was drafted by the Angels. Despite his individual success, the Angels have been unable to form a winning team around him in most of his 10 years. His only postseason appearance came in 2014, and the Angels got swept by Kansas City in the ALDS. But either way, it's pretty obvious that all 21 teams who passed on Trout made possibly the biggest mistake in draft history. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but the signs were all there. All it took was ignoring the past and seeing Trout for who he really was. And the craziest part of all is that Trout might not even be the best player on his own team.